all for joining us. Forgive me as I crane my head, and apologies to those who are sitting behind. We won't be insulted if you want to get up and move. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with my two friends and fellow panelists today. And we're going to invite you to participate with us. This is a very formal setting, and we were hoping for a very informal conversation, so we'll do our best all together to bridge the gap between those two. But before we start, I wanted to give you just a very short thought exercise, which is, and hold this in your mind for the end of the session, what is your favorite public place? And as you're thinking about that, maybe ask yourself why. What are those elements that make this place important to you? I'm an educator, so we always like to leave an awkward amount of time between things so that people can think. So forgive me. We're going to start off a conversation this afternoon, and I'd like to give a chance for both of my panelists to tell you a little bit about their practices actually, and then we'll talk a little bit amongst ourselves. We're going to ask you then to join us in a conversation, and together we're hoping that we can start to define some of the aspects that are essential to us today as we think about claiming, perhaps reclaiming, perhaps creating new public spaces together. And just for context, I wanted to put a couple of things out there. This notion of caring about public space, about protecting it, and investing in it seems ever and even more important and urgent than it has been in the past, as we've all come out of a time of isolation, and as we've learned to connect with each other in the digital space, the question is, yes, what have we gained, but also what have we lost, and what decisions do we want to make about what we want to hold on to? And so I just wanted to put a couple of thoughts out there as we're beginning this conversation. And really it comes down to, what does it fundamentally mean to be human at the end of the day, and to be human in communion with other people who are human. So I want you now to just pay attention. What's the temperature like in this room? How close are the other people to you sitting? What does it feel like to be in the chair? Who else can you see? Do you feel relaxed? No. Neither do we, so it's okay. We're going to work on that. Right, these are all, we are programmed to learn, to store, and to retain information through our bodies and through our senses. If we shut them down, if we don't pay attention to them, we lose a fundamental part of how we're designed to learn and to communicate with each other. And that's really, at the end of the day, some of the concerns that we're here to explore today. So I invited two different space and place makers to the conversation today so that we could think together a little bit about what our sector can contribute to becoming a sort of even more human community in a sense. So the first presenter slash speaker is Jing Liu, who's an architect and whose practice is very much concerned with how to connect with the users of the space as the experts in the process. So instead of putting an idea out there, a space out there, and asking people to use it, she invites those people into the process and thinking about the space even before it's created. So Jing's going to tell us a little bit about some of her projects and some of her concepts and help set the framing for all of us today to think about some of those elements of space that perhaps we take for granted or don't pay as much attention to, and helping us thinking about how we can be more intentional. So Jing.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to be in this amazing platform to talk about space and to talk about architecture. And this is a place where architecture is really playing a very important role in kind of establishing the structure of the society as we speak. We are, as architects, are often asked to design objects in our cities, in our built environment. And we've heard many of those architects today, and I'm definitely of a much younger generation, so I'm not going to talk about those objects. I'm going to talk maybe a little bit about how space affects people, and how people also affect space. And when we talk about the public space, typically architecture is made for private space, even though sometimes it's public institutions. Often you still have to pay a ticket to go into them. But the truly public space often are then the places that we call streets or plaza or squares, those places where basically anyone, any walks of life can go into. And maybe starting from my own kind of personal reflection, I was born in the early 1980 in China, where I still, on the screen you can see these two pictures that I still remember. The streets were a place where all my friends and families and people lived basically collectively, socially together on the streets. And it was in the 1980s and the 1990s on where you just saw a lot of modernization and a lot of construction that kind of steamrolled the entire kind of country, and the streets got widened and widened again and widened again, and trees were cut down. And gradually the streets were taken over by more mechanical objects and less human, and it became harder and harder for people to domesticate the space and to live on the streets. And if we reflect back, this is we can't really advance this slide. Maybe some, okay, great. If we reflect back, that's not unique to China, and it's still happening in many parts of the world. And in Europe, already the kind of post-war construction was taking place in a similar fashion after 1950s, after the war. And this is one of my favorite kind of inspiration, an Italian designer called Ugo La Plata. And in the 1970s, he did this film that's called Inhabiting the City Means Being at Home Everywhere, and in which he invented and kind of created all this very humorous furnitures that really helped the body to start to reclaim this big modernist kind of structures of the city. And he would bring easels that he can sleep on, or hack the Jersey barriers to become the sofa, for example. And that's really a really interesting way to think about how the streets can again be reclaimed by the people and by the bodies, by the individuals. And for example, and this is one of my favorite projects in New York where I live. It's called Storefront for Art and Architecture. It's a very thin sliver of a space, a gallery space, and the facade of the gallery really start to kind of take on this very interactive moment that start to jux out into the sidewalk and occupy the sidewalk. And when it's open, it really start to occupy, expands like twice as much of its footprint by kind of really connecting the streets with the interior space. And if you kind of, I don't know if I can, it doesn't seem like I can operate this space, but you can operate this slides. But if you keep going, advancing the slides, you will see that one of our early projects, next slides. One of our early projects was to take this very iconic storefront as part of the New York sidewalk, and think about how we can, as many years after this project has been kind of created and become symbol of itself, again create another layer of interpretation on top of that. So we wrapped the entire storefront with this almost like shrink-wrapped plastic piece. And the next slide you will see that the storefront was kind of wrapped in this translucent veil, and you start to kind of be able to reinterpret this very, very iconic piece of architecture that was making a statement about the sidewalk in New York. And then the next day, which is the next slides, that you see that well, this actually was 2 days later, our installation was immediately again reinterpreted by people from artists from the neighborhood. And it was really this interesting invitation that we unknowingly sent out, and it was exactly how kind of we thought that the streets should allow us to do, to kind of re-sending out this invitation for people to reinterpret and claim it as they wish and feel compelled to. And next slide, you will see that during the pandemic, the streets of New York has started to take on a very different meaning. We started to really restaurants and public institutions started to make street furnitures and open streets areas so that the people can be outside and then take on these very social activities again on the streets, and there were much less cars driving on the streets during the pandemic as well. So we actually brought a lot of our students and our collaborators and staff out on the streets and started to make a lot of these installations for people to sit, for people to conduct commercial activities again on the streets. This was one of the examples that we did. So kind of if we just move forward with the slides, just keep advancing. Sometimes, the streets is a more linear form of a public space, and we also think about plazas and the squares in that similar fashion. This was, again, one of the earlier inspiration for us to think about how often the plazas and public space are thought of as this very rational elements in our cities, like the Cartesian grid, but we should feel the freedom to play with them and to kind of really pluck at it and then to live in it so that they become flexible and they become elastic and they become interactive. So the next slides, you will see that one of our early installations in the MoMA PS1 courtyard, we made this Cartesian grid, but a completely flexible Cartesian grid so that every poles are interacting with each other. If someone's moving it, it would move the entire system, and we really conceived the entire space as an instrument. A lot of architects talked about music today, and we typically don't think of architecture as something that can be interactive, that can play music, and that can be heard, but this is really kind of our attempt to try to make that happen. Keep going. I think we can just advance the slides quite quickly, and you can see that during the installation there were artists that came and dancers that came, parties and DJs that happened in there, and there was no kind of moment of stillness in the installation throughout the summer. And I also want to kind of maybe talk about that this project is a slightly more static and seemingly symbolic architecture, but in a way that we conceived it, it's really a piece of architectural form that weaves history and weaves different structures that was constructed but demolished and then dilapidated over time, and then kind of trying to weave them and stitch them together as a collective memory. So this was a village in the northern France that was the center and the birthplace of the Art Nouveau glass, which was stemmed in, I think, the 16th century, but in the last 100 years, the entire village and the region really kind of experienced a depression, and a lot of the structures and the economy just kind of completely shut down. So we were brought in, or we entered a competition to kind of really reclaim, well, not reclaim, try to revive the kind of economical life of the region, and by creating a culture center in here. And a lot of people entered this competition and built a really strong kind of iconic architectural form, but we actually decided that we proposed to not make anything too iconic. We decided to actually take a few of the dilapidated industrial buildings and then renovate them and kind of stitch it together and create a center of the town. So in the next few slides, you will see that these are the original old factory buildings and warehouse buildings that hasn't been used and dilapidated for many, many decades. So what we proposed is to just kind of cover the few areas and few structures with this, we call it a picnic blanket, that really stitched it, all of them together and created also a void in the middle that became the courtyard amongst these cultural institutions that was going to kind of move into these places. And then this picnic blanket was able to also go up and down and it stitched different topographies in the village. The village is quite hilly, so they're part of the site that's higher than the other parts of the site. So we were really trying to also bring people in from different elevations around the surrounding of the village, and so that there's not only one entry, there's basically entries all around the site. And if you keep advancing forward of the slides, you can see that this picnic blanket is allowing people to kind of really enter the site from above, but sometimes also below, and sometimes you descend into the courtyard, and sometimes you ascend into the courtyard, or kind of going under the blanket into it. And next slide, we inserted a few smaller structures in order to kind of really complete the entire form of the kind of collection of the buildings. And also these new structures would be able to bring the bodies, the individuals, into the historical kind of ruins of this neighborhood, of this cultural center, and sometimes kind of really bringing you into the heart of the making of the glass studios that were revived as part of this project. And then there are surgical interventions into the old structures that allows it to be programmatically activated again. For example, here is a 500-seat a black box theater that was inserted into the warehouse building, so that the old part of the structure can become an exhibition space, but also opened up to become part of the performance space. There are a lot of programs that happens here, both for the people who live in the village and live in the region, but also a lot of visitors here through the summer. So sometimes you will see very intimate settings like this, and sometimes you will see like 2,000 people concert during the summer happening here. And by kind of really stitching all these buildings that didn't seem to have any purpose anymore, we really kind of try to create this center of the village again through this varying kind of surgical and surgical interventions. And in the same way that this is an idea competition that I thought I'm coming to Abu Dhabi today, and it's good to kind of revisit this project that a couple years back. This was during the Arab Spring movement that there was a competition that was put out to really think about this public space in Bahrain. And I think this was the site is called Bab al-Bahrain, a square, quite a unique historical square in the city that's quite, as you can see in this picture, that's pretty much dominated by vehicular flows and activities only at this moment. So we conceived in the next few slides, you will see like this layers of fabrics and lines that would draw lines and flows and kind of a very, very fine-grained texture of the city into the square and start to weave this multiplicity and the layers of differences into this collective space and then let them coexist side by side with each other. And in a way, in this kind of musical way, really kind of weaving the multiple voices together and let that to echo and kind of play off each other here. I think that might be a good moment to pass the baton on to Emeka, who will talk about the musical activation. This doesn't really work. I think you just have to tell them.
Okay.
I think we're waiting for the second PowerPoint. Ah, there we are. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. My name is Emeka Obo. I'm an artist, and I think I've gone beyond trying to put my practice in a box as a sound artist. In recent times, I started exploring, getting inspired to work from my culture, basically. I'm Igbo from the southeastern part of Nigeria. I'll start by discussing how we navigate the public space and make it more accessible, or how we use the public space. Because by following these practices from my culture, I've started bringing it into my art practice, especially with my art commissions. So back in 2019, I was commissioned to, this is the Cleveland Museum of Arts in Cleveland, and I was the first artist commissioned to create a work for the atrium. I spent time in the atrium looking at how people use the space there, and I was trying to figure out what to do with this huge space. This is probably the biggest space I've ever installed so far. I sort of noticed how people moved around the space and how they used it for gathering, how they used it for social encounters. And that led me back to my culture, the Igbos, and how we used public spaces. The Igbos are quite Republican in nature, and public space is what public space is meant to be. It's open to everyone, but at different, depending on the time of the day, depending on the time of the week, it could serve different purposes. Some days it's for economical use, the market, some days for festivals, some days for gatherings, for politics, and also some days there's a kind of social event at night, like folk songs. So this is an installation that is basically a sculptural piece with 12-channel sound. I work a lot with sound, so I bring in music into my practice. And this was actually the first piece where I worked with an Igbo choir. My intention was to work with music from the Igbos, because music is, I wouldn't say different for us, everybody uses music differently, but we encode a lot into sound, into music. It's not just about the rhythms and the beats. Sometimes there's information encoded there. History is passed down through music. Knowledge is passed down through music. And what I found interesting is a lot of this music are call and responses. I mean, we can't play the music now, but but yeah, a lot of the music are call and responses, because that's how knowledge is imbibed on people. You call, you respond, you remember what it's talking about after a time, because with repetition you understand, or you get to know what it's all about. So that's how I created this space, which was basically a way to make the museum more engaging. You know, the truth is, people have this attitude or a mentality of what museums are supposed to be. We just come there and behave ourselves, look at the artwork and go, or do other things. But by trying to create a playful space where people can sit around, talk, engage, and use it the way I know public spaces to be used. I come from where public spaces are not so governed compared to what you find in Europe or in the West in general. So being able to create this space using materials from the Igbo culture, not just the music, also these fabrics, the fabrics they are sitting on are called akwete. They are hand-woven by women. It's an Igbo fabric that has been in existence for hundreds of years. I was trying to activate this space as much as possible to work with my culture. It's more like translocation, taking something from one place to the other, but all in the line of how public space should be used by everyone. It's how it's meant to be. There's nothing restricting about, like, you use it differently, I use it differently, but this is a public space. We gather, we play, we make the best of it. So this was in 2019, and as you can see, the spaces were used in different forms. When I was also invited to the Gropius Bar to use the atrium, I spent time looking at the atrium and realizing that we can ship the same idea over, but make it more site-specific with the way we install the sound and use the materials that are existing here. And people did react to that, using the space in a different way as against what they were used to in the space. But also like being able to let the space open up. There was no fee charge for people to get to engage with the space, because as far as I'm concerned, if it's a public space, it should be accessible. There's no discrimination in terms of race, gender, or even economic status. So this was a free installation that people could gather, talk, heal, and the interesting thing was also how it was opened up for other artists to be able to use the space. I didn't want to create it like an art piece that is secluded and not out of reach to anybody. It's about building that village square that allows people to gather, come together, and other artists to also engage with the space the way they want to be. So during the installation, there were a lot of engagements by different artists using the space. But I just wanted to talk about how like art spaces or like art in public spaces have different ways of being navigated or being used, not just like creating a space where people can gather and play. Sometimes when you are commissioned to create art in public space, you want to react to what is existing in the public space. And this brings me to this piece called The Cosmos, Things Fall Apart. This is a permanent commission at the Humboldt Forum roof in Berlin. And if you look behind the installation, is the cupola with a Christian inscription and a Christian cross on top. I was brought up a Christian, but I'm Igbo first and foremost. And when I was told to create this piece, or like I was part of the competition to design, to send the artworks for the rooftop. When it was selected, I know that I wanted to also bring that idea of working with my Igbo culture there, but how do you navigate a problematic space where we all know what the Humboldt Forum already signifies, and a lot of artists refuse to engage? I wanted to go back to how we kind of had encounters with the colonialists. This took me to the Chinua Achebe's book called Things Fall Apart. And the third part of the book talks a lot about how the Christian culture, the colonialists, sort of disrupted the Igbo tradition. And I was thinking of how to engage with this space using that same line of thought. There was a quote that really struck me on that in the book, which is like, we laughed at the foolishness of the white man, and we let him, we invited him to be with us, and he ended up converting our brothers, and our clan is no longer what it used to be. He basically put a knife in the middle of that thing that holds us together, and we can no longer stand. Things fall apart. That was how that line developed. And researching the Igbo music list, the Igbos, most of our songs or most of our proverbs are not directly, it's not meant to be like translated the way it's sung. It's really encoded with messages. The music you're going to hear on this installation, it's a music that basically talks about a girl who was sent to the stream to fetch water in a clay pot, and she ended up breaking the pot and she couldn't come back with the water. For the Igbos, the water is quite significant with life. And basically, it's trying to say there are results from our engagements, there are consequences to our actions. And this led back to the Things Fall Apart. So this music comes up at the stroke of every hour here. And timing this to happen at every hour is also a connection to the Christian world. In Europe, basically, the passage of time is noted with the bells, church bells. So how do you create a sound installation that is a kind of a reaction to the Christian colonization of my tradition? So this piece starts at every hour. It talks about actions and consequences, leading back to Things Fall Apart, and how he put a knife on the things that held us together. So this is not exactly that piece where people are invited to play around or engage, but it's more like a sounding piece as a, I don't want to use the word critic, but it reacts to this installation there. And down, one of the buildings across there is the German Foreign Ministry. It also speaks to that in connection to how the colonization happened. This is another installation, but it's also going with the way the public participates in creating an art piece, which is part of what we engage with in our culture. These Two Shall Pass was a piece that sort of reacted to the year 2020. So I was invited to create a public commission for Frankfurt. We wrote a program that scouted the internet and took headlines from all the news from 2020. And the same program sort of looked at the words that appeared more frequently, and we used those words to make music. So we wrote a composition that was performed in 3 languages, Igbo, English, and German. And not just about having it composed and that, we needed it to synchronize together, where it's performed together in these languages, and it all sounds the same, like you think it's one choir basically performing. And I like the idea of working with choir because then it's like a community thing, bringing different people together and being able to have that synchronity, which we were looking at. So this is how we also engage with the public space. This is a bridge over Frankfurt. This is the German choir performing their version of the song for the opening. And I was interested in having this not just installed in a space that maybe people may never come across. The Frankfurt Main, the river that runs across Frankfurt, it's a very important part of the city and an important aspect of the city. So the installation also moved on boats on weekend, going in different places in the city. It was also installed in a church. There are different parts of the installation that I'm not going to go into, but we didn't just create music from the data. We also were able to visualize the data into symbols, which are woven into those fabrics there. I started doing a lot of work with those fabrics as a connection to my culture too. So the installation is musical and also visual, which appears on the fabric. And we're able to also have it in other parts of the city, because the whole idea is not to concentrate it in one place. Let people have access to the installation in different public spaces. And yeah, that's the end of this bit.
Well, thank you both. I've got a couple of questions, and I wrote down some notes from what you were both presenting, and some of the words and concepts that jumped out, which I hope you're all listening to, because I want to try to connect this back to the places that you selected at the beginning when we were just starting. I heard about exchange in both of your presentations, exchange between time and place and people, and about a kind of contextual layering of things that are visible and perhaps making things less visible or less easy to understand, inhabit the space. And I heard about social encounters. That word encounter is interesting to me because it sounds like the beginning of something. It sounds like something that hasn't happened. And it's not so clear from that word how it will end up. And then I heard about this sort of call and response and a notion of sharing a kind of concept through the physical space, that like architecture is something you can engage with, that you can move parts and pieces. That's not something we tend to feel we can do, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. And once you feel you can move it, then how do you begin to be more critical or perhaps even more demanding about the kind of spaces that are designed for you? And a sort of a layering of information in the way we use space. And I'm just kind of curious, one, if you have questions for each other, but also what you think we are risking if we stop investing in and trying to activate or create spaces that are really communal and really designed for people to use and that are public. What would disappear from our world because it's easy for all of us, I think, to move away from public space at this moment. There's a lot of things about the spaces that we inhabit together that can seem dangerous, can seem threatening, but they're also so fundamental to almost every culture, right? That people have a place to gather. So right at this moment, from your respective disciplines and perspectives, what is important about public space and what do we need to do to kind of reanimate or to recommit to it?
Public spaces should still be public. It should be about the public. It should be about like the people, the community, and in many ways, they should also be brought in the creation of the spaces, in the designing of the spaces. It's not happening so much like that, and I think people are getting more bored of the spaces. It's the same thing, the same design, the same setup. It's never dynamic, it never changes, you know. And people moving towards that virtual world instead, or being online, I think it has to do a lot with freedom and access. Public spaces are not as accessible as it should be. You know, yes, these spaces exist, but in many ways it's policed, it's blocked off. Maybe at certain times of the day you cannot access the spaces, or you cannot do certain things in the spaces. It's not as public as it should be anymore. As against when I go online, I can be wherever I am. Like if you get into a virtual world, you can definitely explore, do different things, be where we choose to be without having that kind of policing that exists there. How do we bring people into that policy of creating public spaces and deciding how we should be used, when it should be used, and what it's used for, rather than having it imposed on us? You know, even in terms of the architectural designs, how do we engage the public in coming up with the designs for those places? You know, the truth is like many public spaces have this kind of visual that tends to be all about the aesthetics, making it looking pretty and stuff, but it's beyond that. How do we bring other human senses into that consideration? How do we make it more sensorial? And I think this will appeal more to people using the spaces, going out into the spaces and feeling safe in the spaces, you know.
I think those questions are actually for you. How do we do it?
Yeah, I think what is at risk, right? I think what is at risk is trust between human beings. I think, Emeka, you were saying that the public space tend to be same, you know, even not from an architectural background, you can identify that. You know, often we try to design this public space and the streets for maximum flexibility. And by doing so, we're risking basically ending humanity or human differences in there, because you're trying to design for no one, right? And also in that maximum flexibility and this kind of largeness that it's supposed to contain the public, which is the Greek words populace, right? That it makes it very difficult to inhabit by individuals and by groups of individuals. So then we oscillate between this collection of the sameness versus the opposition of that, or the atomized individual. But actually, I think that human society are much more fine-grained. You know, we have a lot of sameness we share, and a lot of differences we share. And it's always this kind of very nuanced scale, you know, of shades of things. It's not this or that. And what we see in the public discourse these days is very much like, you know, we're all about this one idea in one moment, and next day we're about this completely different idea, you know, or we're against something. And this radicalization is the result of how we design our public realms. I believe has a lot to do with that. And as architects, you know, my language is form, my language is surface and geometry, and I do think that if we make forms that are too assertive, it invites opposition, and it invites aggression, and it invites people feeling that they have to, you know, work extra hard to fight against it. And if we make lines that are too straight, and then you have a hard time to feel that whatever you do can have an imprint because it's just so rational and it's just so an absolute, right? And then it loses the ability to kind of let people to leave this messy and organic imprint on them. So those are the language that I try to think about. You know, how can we make space that are a little bit more organic, a little bit more elastic, so that whenever we inhabit it, it leaves imprint, and then the next person, maybe 2 days later, maybe 2 months later, or maybe 2 years later, that comes, feel that other people have inhabited this space, maybe 2 centuries before, right? So I think this dialogue in space through time is something we should make our space to be able to do. And hopefully through that, the conversation will become much more nuanced.
Yeah, but one thing I noticed, like with my installations, especially like the ones I did inside the museums with the seating arrangement, I realized trying to make it a bit not rigid, like it's not fixed. It's sort of freestanding where people can decide how they move the cubes, what they do with it, like kids would play with it, like stack it up. It made it more interesting for them. It made it something they wanted to revisit because then you can have different angles of perception or perspectives to this. Can this also possibly come into the design of such spaces outside like the art world, where, for example, playgrounds become more dynamic in the sense that we can move things? How possible could that be? Like Lego sets, play with that. I think when people sort of feel more involved in that situation or deciding today, I want the slide to be over there because I want this view, maybe that will draw people out more, because I will find that boring when I go back to the same park. I know where everything is. It's still fixed. It's always fixed. I can't change anything there. Is that possible in architecture to make those forms more playful or more movable? So I feel that I have a sense of being part of the design.
Yeah, I mean, earlier we were talking about that maybe the title of our conversation should have not been make space public. It should be actually allowing space to be public.
Yeah.
Because I think, we named our PS1 installation pole dance, and we talked about the importance of play, because when people are playing, they're just so much more creative, and then there's scientific evidence of dopamines and all of things that's being released when you're playful, right? And so having a space to engage people to play is good for many reasons. But often the play, when we are thinking about even kids' playground these days, there's such a intentionality. There's colors and there's like forms that are quite rigid. That we actually talked about the pole dance as a game that does not have a rule. That you can invent your own, rules to play in this environment. And I think that's the true play, not to make someone to play in a certain ways, but actually allowing them to feel that how can we design the space in a way that allows the play to naturally happen. And I think color has a lot to do with that. Forms and kind of elasticity, as I mentioned, has a lot to do with that. Yeah.
I mean, and for both of you, and I admire this greatly, you're inspired and interested in the ways people sort of hack your spaces and do things with them that you perhaps didn't plan. So you could have showed the slide with the graffiti or the drawing on top of the installation as a failure, but instead you saw it as a layer of additional meaning and as an exciting sort of response to what you prompted. And having lived with Alma, the installation at the Cleveland Museum of Art, working there for 3-4 months, I could see all the different uses. There were like book clubs that started to meet there, and staff taking naps in the space, and just all this additional layer of use that people brought because they understood there was an invitation.
Yeah.
So maybe actually, because I want to leave a little bit of time to hear from some of the audience what those spaces are that you are connected to, and whether you have questions for either of our panelists about why and how those spaces work. But that if there isn't an invitation, if you feel like you are supposed to just observe, or that it's clear you're supposed to react in one way, you're supposed to feel small, or you're supposed to be quiet, or you're supposed to behave in a certain way, it doesn't tend to lead to a kind of creative or social engagement, right? It tends to sort of isolate us. So that notion that you're putting an invitation out as opposed to kind of a statement, I think it can be seen and can be felt in the work that you both do.
Yeah.
But maybe the best example is this setting, right? We are in the middle of this stadium, which means that by default, somehow what we say is applied with a layer of significance. It doesn't really matter what we say, and we're kind of elevated on the podium, right? So maybe what we should do is to actually walk to the audience. Like, I'm not getting out of my chair.
No, I mean, the initial plan wasn't what ended up being here, but we wanted to make this playful. We wanted to turn this into a kind of nightclub, have a bigger disco light up here, play music, but sorry, it didn't get to happen. But,
Instead, you just had to listen to us talk.
you know.
But are there thoughts, observations, questions for, yeah?
Well, I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to address what you said at the start of the conversation about a place that you think you like is a public space, and what about it makes you feel like it is a public space. So I'll just talk about in terms of UAE. I'm originally Dubai-based, so I remember coming down to the country here, being here for the first time, even though I'm super extroverted, but it really matters what your setting is like, if it's welcoming or not. And public spaces play that kind of role for people. So coming down here, completely new in the country, having no friends, and I can think on the top of my head 2 places. In terms of Dubai, it would be the Dubai Design District and Al Circle Avenue. Why those 2 places are significant in my case, I guess for everybody it will be different. But in terms of me, because I'm a DJ, and the first thing I heard about those places were they are, first of all, free, like he addressed, that there was no monetary aspect connected to that, that I can just pick up like without even caring about what attire I'm in, super casual on a weekend, just walk in and meet people. So it gave me that kind of access. And secondly, just the community feel to it. So to answer your part about the brainstorming part, which you said that, okay, which is your favorite public space and why? I would be thinking about the first thing that comes to my mind is the community aspect. It makes me feel like I can connect with you and I'm not rigid or feeling tight or tense walking in that space. And one event in particular that comes to my mind in terms of the spaces, I remember D3, which is the Dubai Design District, walking in that space for the first time, and there were 2 restaurants. In the middle of the space between the 2 restaurants, they had an alleyway. No special architecture, nothing in place, literally a dark alleyway where they placed the stage, had a couple of DJs, bean bags, that's it. Like, there was no special, I would say, any expenses or any that kind of extraordinary work done there, but just having bean bags and a stage and a set of speakers, how it connected people, because I became a DJ in the pandemic, just visiting a place like that, and that was how my career kick-started. Walking in a space, finding a bean bag, meeting people, and that's it. Like, I met some of the top DJs in that area, and it just transformed everything for me. So that's why I just wanted to express how important a public space is, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that there has to be something monumental, or you have to build something, or it has to hold any like heavy meaning to it. Like, you can just walk into spaces without any work done and create something out of it, So, yeah, in my case, I think I can think of 2 places, D3 and Al Circle Avenue. They're super, super memorable. as part of my career as well, and they still continue to be good places for people to network and feel welcomed, you know. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It seems like we planted you, but we didn't. But
Hi, first of all, thank you for the very insightful conversation. I sort of have a question. So I'm currently working with the NYUAD Research Kitchen on a project on public spaces in Abu Dhabi. And we're focusing more on public parks in the, if you're familiar with Abu Dhabi, the Al Zahia area. And so my question to you guys is, from what you've observed, how much of a role do you think ethnicity and class play in access to public spaces, especially when you have something like Al Emirat Park, which has, you know, an entrance fee, more, I would say, higher price cafes versus a very public park in the Al Zahia area in the heart of the city?
I think I'm going to ask my panelists if they want to respond, but huge, though, you know, all the ways that we understand ourselves and understand ourselves in relation to other people, and where we feel we belong and where we feel we don't belong, and what all those signals and cues are, has everything to do with whether a space and how a space feels public and to whom. And that's why I think it's so interesting to hear how artists and architects think about those things, so that we all understand they're not a given, right? They're constructed to communicate a certain kind of message to all of us. Do either of you want to?
Of course, it plays a big role in, it should play a big role in the design of a public space, putting things into consideration. But the truth is that I think even after the design, things can play out in a certain way. For example, installing in an art museum, there are certain ethnic groups that will keep away from there because they already have this mentality of what the museum could be. I'm not saying it should be that, but I know that, for example, the Nigerians, when I've done installations and, you know, the Nigerians, the first questions, they will be like, you know, we have to pay to enter, or this place is not really for migrants because there's a way they view people that go there, you know. Then there are certain notions that also plays out that makes you decide to keep away from certain places. It happens to me, I live in Berlin. There are certain parks that I will stay away from because to go there as a black person, I get asked for drugs, like, are you selling drugs and stuff? And that will also possibly profile me with the cops there, or in certain parts of the US, being a black person. So yes, things get put into consideration into the designs, but certain mentality or notions also plays out afterwards that affect the use of these places. It's not always a given, and it doesn't always have to happen like that, but it does happen. I mean, how do we change this? How do we change all these perceptions? That's a general community question, you know.
And I think that's exactly what we're here to discuss, which is if we care as a community that to build a sense of public trust, and as Jing, you mentioned before, that there is a space for both difference and connection. We have to be conscious of all of the factors that play into where and how we feel comfortable showing up, and what it is that we can do to make all of us more aware of that. So if we're in a position to to create an invitation, that is in fact what we do.
When public spaces are created, I mean, you're an architect, is there kind of research, data analysis, or feedback from the community to help design that place, or basically one day they place your surfaces?
Community engaged design is definitely something that has taken on quite a bit recently, in the last, I would say, like 10, 15 years, all over the world, and we're seeing more and more of that. But I don't think it's very developed yet. You know, because to connect the people who are using that space, how can I say that? People typically imagine something that doesn't exist is a hard thing to do, right? So when you are putting the questions of what do you want to see happen in a space, typically they resort to what they're used to, and not what you can imagine, right? So to really tease out and kind of take out the blockage of that layer of imagination is something that we're still kind of, as designer, trying to figure out how to engage the users in a meaningful way so that the answers, are not only coming out of a past experience, but it's also allowing people to imagine what it could be. But maybe just going back to the previous question about the barrier and the threshold of the public space. This is not to kind of trying to not be responsible as designers, and I do think that there are spaces that communicate belonging and spaces that communicate exclusions for sure. But I also think that we have seen throughout the history examples of people misuse and abuse and reinterpret the space over and over again. You can make a forbidden city, and if the kings or emperors are not living there anymore for a couple decades, and then there's no guards that keep you from going in there, people use it as a park. You can make a pyramid that you're not supposed to go in there, but if no one is taking it as a sacred space, people use it as a park. So I think part of the most important thing of making places accessible is to remove the boundary and remove the threshold, right? Like remove the governance. And I think over time, public and people do have the power to kind of claim it. It might take a little bit longer than otherwise if the space was intended to be inhabited, and that will happen naturally. But over time, if the boundary is not there and if the guards are not there, it will be inhabited eventually.
That's probably a great place to end. Thank you to both of my fellow panelists for setting some terms and exploring some of your own practices. And thank you so much to all of you in the audience for your questions and your comments. I hope this has given you just a couple more tools to think critically about the kind of spaces that you use, the kind of spaces that you want, and perhaps even new ways to use the ones that already exist. So thank you.